On this Veterans Day special of Laid Back History, we're talking about the last soldier from Washington County to be killed during the First World War. So I'd like to welcome you back to an all-new episode of Laid Back History. And I know it's Friday. We don't normally do anything on Fridays, but I thought that we should do something special to recognize Veterans Day. Sometimes it goes by a little too quickly and we kind of, oh yeah, it's Veterans Day and we move on. The banks are closed or, public offices are closed, but we forget what it actually is. All veterans, whether they made the ultimate sacrifice, whether they saw service during war, or whether they were in the reserves, they were willing to make a sacrifice for this country, and they need to be recognized. I think we overlook them too often. You see somebody walking down the road or walking down the sidewalk, and they have a hat on, Marines, Navy, whatever it is. How many times do we actually recognize them? Do we just walk right by? My dad is a veteran, and a good friend of mine, Rich Baker, his father is a veteran, and it's kind of been instilled in me, through my dad and through Rich, that when you see somebody, you see a veteran, stop, offer to shake their hands, and tell them thank you for their service. So I didn't want to let this day go by without recognizing, veterans and Veterans Day. So the story I want to tell, it's not going to be a long story. I wanted to talk a little bit about the last soldier that was killed during action in World War I. The last Washington County soldier killed during action in World War I. It was on the final day, as most of us have learned in history class, the war, the armistice went into place on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. November 11th at 11 a.m., 1918, the war basically comes to an end. But there was fighting up to that point. It's not like when the delegates started meeting that, fighting ceased. Nobody knew how long, the negotiations would take to end the war, and so the fighting continued. And on that final day, there are thousands of men killed, and one of them was from Washington County. So I just want to quickly tell, the story of a gentleman, Paul M. Steator. Paul was born in 1895. He was a graduate of Washington High School, and he actually became one of the first men from Washington County to enlist during World War I. So it was July 24th, 1917, that he enlisted. He would be sent down to Parris Island, South Carolina, where he would do his training. And so by February of the following year, of 1918, he's in Europe. He is a member of the 5th Marines, and it's a very storied, division of the Marines, probably the most decorated. And so as part of the 5th Marines, he saw some of the heaviest action that the American Expeditionary Force would see. He was involved in, he was in trench warfare in Verdun in the frontline trenches. He was involved in fighting at Belleau Woods, the Blancmont Ridge, and a bunch of other French names that I can't pronounce, so I'm not even going to try. Probably not pronouncing those right. And then finally, at the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he was involved in that, which was the last major push at the end of the war. He was, by all accounts, every one of his evaluations was excellent. He received basically top scores in every category. The one I liked is he received an excellent in sobriety. So apparently he did not drink that much, but his commanding officers constantly gave him good rankings. And so he was promoted pretty quickly. By August of 1918, he had been promoted to corporal. Then he was promoted to sergeant. and by the end of the war, at the time of his death, he was an acting lieutenant of his platoon. So, he went up pretty quickly. And they said that, even with his small stature, he was only 5'5", about 150 pounds, but they said he was a commanding presence and that his men would follow him anywhere because he was willing to put himself in danger to help protect his men. And he was very well respected by the men that he led in his platoon. And so, after the victory at Blancmont Ridge, the 5th Marines, which were under the command of General Pershing, actually, they would be moved into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and they had pushed forward pretty quick. And so they were continuing that offensive November 10th. I mean, when the delegates had met to try to sign a ceasefire and armistice, they're still pushing forward, and so they were on the opposite banks of the Meuse River near Sedan. They pushed that far, and so during the offensive, there was a wood line. As they were crossing, they were pushing forward. There was a wood line, and there was a gunner that had his platoon pinned down. And he basically single-handedly went and took out the gunner and the gunner's assistant. And I wanted to read what was his commanding officer wrote about his death. Constantly exposing himself to danger to safeguard the platoon entrusted to his care, he entered a copse of woods alone in the darkness of night after crossing of the Meuse and shot the gunner and helper of a machine gunner whose fire was raking the platoon position. On his return, he was exposed to a volley of the entire company that had been ordered against the woods. And then in a March 1921 article in the Washington Observer, it said that he was hit by an explosive shell, and that's what had caused his death. It was around 1 a.m. on November 11th. 10 hours away from the armistice, and he lost his life and became the last soldier from Washington County to be killed during World War I. He gave that ultimate sacrifice. He went fighting for what he believed in, and he gave himself for his country. There was, I forget who the quote was from, but said of soldiers that you didn't fight because of a hate of what was in front of you, but rather for a love of what was behind you. That these men were fighting for their country. They were fighting, for their home country and for what they believed in. And so many times I think we forget, when you see all this stuff that's going on today, the stupid political fighting, and the just comments by politicians and by leaders out there and by, celebrities having the freedom to say what they want to say and all this stuff that you can find, and all the infighting that we have between political parties. We forget that we are able to do that because we are free. And these men fought to maintain that, to help keep that freedom for us. So we can act like idiots because they acted like heroes. So, sorry, I get a little emotional about it. I wish more people did. Maybe that would be a good thing. So, but that's it. I just wanted to do a quick episode, tell the story of Paul Martin Steator and his ultimate sacrifice that he made. And I hope you'll join me on Tuesday for another special episode of Laid Back History on Veterans Day. I'll be joined by Rich and Brian, and we're going to tell the stories of some of our family that are veterans. I'll be talking about my dad. Rich will be talking about his dad, and then Brian will be talking about his uncle. So hope you'll join us for that. And it's going to be very laid back. We're just going to kind of talk back and forth and tell some stories. So But whether it's today, tomorrow, whenever it is, if you're walking down the street, you see somebody, you see a veteran, shake their hand, tell them thank you.
A few moments ago, I placed a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And as I stepped back and stood during the moment of silence that followed, I said a small prayer. And it occurred to me that each of my predecessors has had a similar moment, and I wondered if our prayers weren't very much the same, if not identical. We celebrate Veterans Day on the anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I, the armistice that began on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And I wonder, in fact, if all Americans' prayers aren't the same as those I mentioned a moment ago. For all we can ever do for our heroes is remember them and remember what they did, and memories are transmitted through words. We see these soldiers in our mind as old and wise. We see them as something like the founding fathers, grave and gray-haired. But most of them were boys when they died, and they gave up two lives, the one they were living and the one they would have lived. When they died, they gave up their chance to be husbands and fathers and grandfathers. They gave up their chance to be revered old men. They gave up everything for our country, for us. And all we can do is remember. There's always someone who is remembering for us. No matter what time of year it is or what time of day, there are always people who come to this cemetery, leave a flag or a flower or a little rock on a headstone, and they stop and bow their heads and communicate what they wished to communicate. I think sometimes of General Matthew Ridgway, who, the night before D-Day, tossed sleepless on his cot and talked to the Lord and listened for the promise that God made to Joshua, "I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." We are surrounded today by the dead of our wars. We owe them a debt we can never repay. All we can do is remember them and what they did and why they had to be brave for us. All we can do is try to see that other young men never have to join them. Today, as never before, we must pledge to remember the things that will continue the peace. Today, as never before, we must pray for God's help in broadening and deepening the peace we enjoy. Let us pray for freedom and justice and a more stable world. And let us make a compact today with the dead, a promise in the words for which General Ridgway listened: "I will not fail thee nor forsake thee."